Welcome to this evening's edition of Resistance TV. Tonight we're going to be discussing Israel's latest plan to steal even more Palestinian land. But annexation isn't new. It's something that has been an issue really since, even before 1948, which was itself when Israel was created, an annexation. And we know that that led to 750,000 Palestinians being forcibly removed from their homes. But settlers were setting up settlements in the Palestine as long ago as the late 19th century. But this latest move has been made possible by Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century, but it's more like the steal of the century. He claims that his vision is a win-win opportunity for both sides, but his vision's in breach of international law. The UN Secretary General's called the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans. And the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights said on Monday this week that Israel's plans to illegally annex a swathe of the occupied Palestinian territory would have a disastrous impact on the human rights of the Palestinian people. Now, this evening, we're hoping to be joined by 6 panelists. 2 of them are already with us today. But I'll just go through who they all are. We have Azzam Tamimi, who's a Palestinian writer and journalist. And although he describes Zionism as a racist ideology, he's previously said that peace may still be achievable by talking on how to coexist. And we're also going to be joined, we hope, by Bessam Tamimi, who lives in the West Bank and organizes weekly demonstrations against the illegal Israeli settlements. And is, of course, Ahed's father. Issa Amro also lives in Hebron, and he's a youth worker who's organized a number of peaceful campaigns against Israeli occupation. And Suarez is a writer and an academic and a professional musician. And his book, The State of Terror, describes how terrorism created modern Israel. And the 2 guests who are with us at the moment are Miko, Peled, who was born and raised in Jerusalem and wrote the book A General's Son, a journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And he's considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine. And finally, we have Mick Napier, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Scotland. And his Twitter header reads, "Anti-Semitism is a crime and anti-Zionism is a duty." His pro-Palestinian activities have seen him arrested on a number of demonstrations to highlight the involvement of British companies in facilitating the illegal settlements in Palestine. But if I could maybe start with you, Miko, and if you could perhaps just give us your thoughts on the latest annexation plans, which were due to go ahead today. What's your reading of the latest situation?
Well, thank you, Chris, for inviting me in, for putting together this great panel. I hope everybody can join us, all the guests that you've invited, because these are some terrific people and some really important voices that need to be heard, each and every one of them. And I'm very glad to be part of this. Well, it's exactly like you said. I mean, this is in the introduction. This is one more step in a long line of actions that were taken by the Zionist movement in preparation for establishing a so-called Jewish state in Palestine, dispossessing Palestinians from their land, and then leading up to 1948, and then in 1948, engaging in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, which, like you said, close to 1 million people were forced out of their homes, and hundreds of Palestinian towns and cities and mosques and churches and private homes and so forth were destroyed, only to build what we know today as the State of Israel. And at that point, only close to 80% of Palestine was taken, basically annexed by this new creation, by the State of Israel. An apartheid regime was imposed, which gave all the privilege to people like myself, who were Israeli Jews, and took away the rights from the Palestinians who remained. And of course, the Palestinians who were forced into exile were not permitted to return to this day. And then some 20 years later, Israel expanded some more, took the rest of the 20% or so of Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and basically it has taken all of Palestine. And what it has done is, with the taking of the West Bank, is little by little, it is applying what they call Israeli sovereignty, what we would call annexation, to choice parts of that area, and slowly and surely applying Israeli law to the settlers who live in these areas. So in 1980, they did this to East Jerusalem. They applied Israeli law and basically annexed East Jerusalem. In 81, they annexed the Syrian Golan Heights, which was also taken in 1967. And it was expected that the next step would really be this area which has been taken now, which they're discussing now, which is the Jordan River Valley, which is the eastern strip of the West Bank, which borders with the Jordan River and the state of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. And this is because it's fertile land. It is relatively sparsely inhabited by Palestinians. In terms of the Israeli thinking, in terms of the Israeli perspective, it's not really occupied. Somehow the Jordan River Valley is always viewed as part of Israel. It's within the consensus, so it's not so controversial. There are lots of settlements there already, and it's interesting because the settlers in that area are not exactly considered settlers for some reason by Israeli, again, within the Israeli consensus. And now, even though they've decided to delay the announcements for diplomatic reasons and internal political reasons, we already saw this morning on the ground settlers moving into areas, Palestinian areas, in full force, with the Israeli army protecting them in an area near Hebron, in the southern part of this area that is being annexed. And throughout the entire area, Palestinians are already feeling that the new boss is going to be the State of Israel, not the Palestinian Authority as it's been until now. And it's expected that it'll be a gradual process for Israel to actually announce that it has annexed it, because that way it keeps the critics at bay slightly and allows the Europeans and others to kind of come to terms with this and not be too punitive towards Israel.
It's been suggested, Miko, that the annexation, if it's going to happen, needs to take place during Donald Trump's presidency. And obviously there's elections this year, and so there was speculation that they will try and speed it along before the election, because if there is a change in presidency, and that's the moot point, of course, that this then may fall off the table. And it's really only been facilitated, has it not, by Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century. I mean, what's your thoughts if there is a change of presidency? Do you think this will fall off the table, and do you think Israel will pursue it irrespective, or what's your view about that?
I think Israel is going to pursue it between now and November. I don't think they're going to wait. Certainly the deal of the century, or as you called it, the steal of the century, has facilitated this, has made it easier. I think it was expected that the Israeli government will annex that part of the West Bank anyway. Of course, Donald Trump helped because he's such a great supporter of Netanyahu, and so forth. And then it'll be like with Jerusalem. It'll be a fait accompli. It'll be done. And so, or the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's sovereignty over occupied Jerusalem. It'll be the same thing. It's not something that a new president is going to reverse. I fully expect that between now and November, this will be done. And we have to remember there are already, Israeli settlements, Israeli colonies throughout the area. Israeli military presence is already there. So really, it's a formality that has a lot to do with pleasing Netanyahu, pleasing his right flank, pleasing the settler movement. Because once Israeli law is applied to these areas officially, and it is annexed, or Israeli sovereignty is applied, then it's a lot easier for them to build more settlements. It's a lot easier for them to get permits to build and expand and take away Palestinian land. And it's a lot easier for the security forces to come in and expel Palestinians and so on. So this is in many ways an internal Israeli, has a lot more to do with Israeli internal politics than than anything else, because it's Netanyahu needs to pay back to his his right flank, his right supporters, which are now probably the strongest political bloc in Israeli politics. But I would fully expect this will be done one way or another before the next elections here in the U.S.
Just before I bring Mick in and get his take, there was some reportage of demonstrations taking place in Israel against these proposals. And how widespread, in your assessment, is the opposition to the government's plans to annex this part of the West Bank? In terms of Israel itself, I mean, Israelis, I mean, how widespread would you suggest the opposition to the government actually is?
Well, the opposition is not to the annexation. The opposition is to the method that Netanyahu is taking. So the two political ways of thinking among Israelis in large are: there's the Netanyahu way, which has been very successful for Netanyahu. Obviously, they keep re-electing him, so they like what he's doing, which is to be bold and frank and more brutal than what is perhaps polite and diplomatically sound. And the other one is to say, no, let's take it easy. Let's take it one step at a time. Let's continue with these endless, useless negotiations. We need to present ourselves as peace-loving and moderate and so forth, so that we don't get punished by the Europeans and so forth. And so the protests that were there against the annexation were mostly by people who are thinking that he should do it slower. He should take his time. This should be part of a negotiated agreement, which of course will never be reached because the Palestinians can't possibly agree, to the Trump plan. But among the majority of Israelis voted for the people who are sitting in the government now, and they all support the annexation. They all support the killing of Palestinians. They all support the oppression and so forth that's been going on. Mm-hmm. So it's really just a matter of cosmetics whether they do it in a more kind of frontal, brutal way, or if they do it slightly more diplomatically.
Yeah. Mick, just to get your initial thoughts, the Israeli Labour Party are very much on board with sort of the whole Zionist agenda, and very much similar, really, in many ways, to the British Labour Party today, regrettably. But in terms of the two-state, so-called two-state solution, is that really a viable proposition now, given the way in which the West Bank has been completely atomized? If you look at a map today to the map that existed, well, certainly in 1948 anyway, I mean, it's unrecognizable. I mean, is a two-state solution a viable proposition going forward? Or I know that many people are now saying that that's really dead in the water, and what we should be arguing for is a one-state solution, a secular one-state solution with equal rights for all communities. What's your thinking on that, and also your take on the annexation proposals?
I think when we talk about the annexation proposal or threat or open conversation by Netanyahu and his support, and Gantz and the supporters about taking over another giant chunk of the West Bank, it's striking that it's part of a one-way process. I mean, if we go in close and look at what's happening in detail on the ground, as Miko Peled has done, we can see how this makes sense, how recent planning in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem dictates which are the next pieces that they grab. But if we also stand back and take the long view, it's just like something that spreads always in one direction and never retreats. It's a constant process of dispossession. And if we can say something, if we can pose it really simply in a way that makes sense to people and covers the whole process, this is a one-way process of dispossession, of moving property, moving land from Palestinian ownership and control into exclusively Jewish ownership and control, Zionist Jewish control. And it never moves in reverse. This is a one-way process. And I think the problem now is that there are real worries in Western chancelleries. I think that even Boris Johnson, I mean, he said yesterday or today, he sort of wagged his finger at Netanyahu and said, don't do this. The German foreign minister went there and said, look, if you do this, there will be repercussions. But of course, we will fight any sanctions inside the EU as a German government. We'll wag our finger again. But although it looks like business as usual, and the Israelis know very well the choreography, the EU expresses displeasure verbally, but nothing ever happens. Rather sweetheart deals follow one after the other. I think there's a problem now because it's reaching a stage where the very idea of a two-state solution is patently ludicrous. It has been a complete impossibility for anyone with access to a Google map for a very, very long time. But nonetheless, Western chancelleries have trotted out the same thing. Why don't you take sanctions when the UNHCR finds Israel guilty of slaughtering children, men and women, knowing that they are children, men and women, and so on? Well, let's have a two-state solution. We're not going to interfere. But that now looks, it's not something that I think governments can sell easily anymore. So I think Netanyahu, in the eyes of some critical Zionists, ought to be careful about what he's wishing for, because it completely closes off the alibi that Western governments have for doing nothing while the Palestinians are violated. Because, war crime follows war crime. You have ministers of the government who talk openly in a genocidal discourse. We've had what do you call them, interior ministers in the past, I forget his name, Eli Yishai, who can openly say, and this is what I would suggest, Chris, I'm not a great fan of the current Labour Party, but it's still not the same as a government or a party where a leader can say on open TV, this is a white man's country. We're not yet there in Britain, and I think it's a dark, dark place. And much of the discourse of Israeli government ministers, and I want to avoid hyperbole, but it fits much more neatly with the BNP than even with New Labour, of which I am absolutely not a fan. So I think what Miko said is right. This is another huge land grab. But, anybody who thinks it's radically new doesn't know anything about the history, because it's just the latest in this inexorable process. And I think the problem now is, or maybe the hope is, by the way, the Israelis are going to send Hotoveli as their ambassador to London. Now that is a sign to the Brits and others. They're not going to try and placate the Brits. They're not going to provide the alibi. They're going to say openly and brutally to the Brits, we're doing this, suck on it. We've given you an alibi in the past to pretend that you're neutral, pretend that you're committed to human rights. You can continue to sell sniper rifle parts to the Israeli army, but we're not going to cover for you anymore. We're in for ethnic cleansing, pure and simple. We want all of Palestine, every square metre, with ideally no Palestinians. Now, what shall we talk about? And I think it's a problem for Western chancelleries, because they've got away with this for a very, very long time. And they've got away with it, if I can say one more thing, Chris, they've got away with it in a situation where Israel has overwhelming power. As Miko says, they'll move in settlers, they'll move in the army. They can pretty much do what they want with their crushing military power. But for a very, very long time, the Palestinians have kind of won in the field of international public opinion, because Israel, not in terms of open political discourse, Israel is a pariah state. And, you only have to go back to that infamous, I don't know if you know about it, but the famous EU opinion poll of every country across the whole of the EU, financed by the EU. Citizens were asked, a big long list of countries, North Korea, Syria, Israel, and so on, who's the biggest threat to world peace? 59% of Europeans said Israel. And Franco Frattini, the EU foreign minister, said to Israel, he apologized for the opinions of Europeans and promised Israel those opinions would not influence EU foreign policy. Now, Israel's brutal on the ground towards the Palestinians. They need a green light from the USA. But I wonder if I can throw this as a question, because people I quite respect say it's only the USA that counts. I'm not sure. I think Israel's biggest trading partner is the EU, and it needs to keep the EU, if not sweet, at least indulgent. And I think if they go too far, it may open up a vulnerability in our elites for popular opinion to express itself, mainly through BDS.
In view of that public opinion that you mentioned there, and very clear of human rights, Israel's in breach in international law. Somehow the politicians in this country, from left to right, seem very reluctant to criticize the Israeli state and seem to be apologists for them. Even the Labour Party now seems to be completely enthralled to the Zionist lobby, which, in my opinion, is a racist ideology. How do you account for that, Mick, in your opinion? What's going on? I mean, I've often been critical in the last sort of 18 months or so about representative democracy not really being fit for purpose, because I keep asking myself the question, who are they representing on foreign policy issues and indeed on domestic issues for that matter? But on this particular issue, I mean, it's very odd, isn't it, that people are very fearful about speaking out, and some just an out-and-out apologists. I mean, look, if this was South Africa, back in the day, I mean, it was almost trendy, wasn't it, to be against apartheid, and yet here we are, from the leader of the Labour Party to Boris Johnson, and right across the piece on both sides of the chamber in the House of Commons, there's very few voices speaking out.
But if I can be a little bit rude and risky on your program, one of my favourite comedians, you're probably too young to remember him, was Lenny Bruce. Great American comedian, a prophet. Yeah. And he's in Nevada or somewhere, and he says, "Hey, in this state, you got a law against sex with animals." He said, "My God, you must have had a problem." Now, you don't pass laws unless there's a problem. And in the USA at the moment, in the Congress, there's a bill that's hanging around 50% or even more support for $1 million fine for people doing what we do, which is campaign for BDS. Miko's badge might be dressed up as a campaign. $1 million, and I think it's 10 or 20 years in prison if you're found guilty.
Mick, Johnny, just unpack a little bit when you finish that point. Just unpack what you mean by BDS, because some people viewing may not be familiar with it.
Sure, jargon. It's the call from Palestine civil society. It really, and a fantastically representative assembly of different groups, refugee committees, medical committees, street cleaners, doctors, everything. And they've come together in the Boycott National Committee to issue a call for people around the world to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, they issued this 1 year to the day after they won a key legal case against Israel in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And the learned judges, in their overwhelming majority, declared that Israel's wall was a crime, was illegal, and enjoined every affiliated government to take concrete action in support of the Palestinians to have the wall removed and compensation paid to those Palestinians whose lives had been devastated. In the following year, arms sales increased. There were no sanctions, not even a whiff of sanctions, rather the opposite. And so Palestinians decided they cannot rely on these governments. They have to appeal, as did the South African Freedom Liberation Movement. They have to appeal to civil society. They're a rerun of a situation where Reagan and Thatcher call Mandela a terrorist. Essentially, the same message goes out today about the Palestinians, and therefore they have to appeal, as did the ANC, to churches, trade unions, civil society in the round. And, it's been fantastically successful. I mean, I'm speaking to you with thank you for the invitation. I should have been as polite as Miko at the beginning. Thanks for the invitation. I'm speaking to you from Scotland. And, the Edinburgh Festival is the biggest arts festival in the planet. We have, through popular protest, made it uninhabitable for state-sponsored cultural groups to come to the Edinburgh Festival or Fringe. Israelis who want to come here and busk in the street and they're unencumbered by affiliation with, promotion by the state, they can come here and have a great time. But the message has gone out in Israel that if you're promoted by the state, if the ambassador comes to one of your gigs, as used to happen, then all hell will break loose, and leading cultural figures will call for you not to be allowed. Street protesters will turn up by the 100, and your performances will not be permitted. Now, that's just cultural boycott. Right across the board, the BDS movement is a major hope for Palestinians. They have to free themselves, but we have an auxiliary role to play here in reducing the cost. So you've made me lose my strain of thought.
No, well, the question I was really something like that. I just thought it's important just to
if I could just make the point, Chris, if I make the point I was going to make.
In this country are not speaking out on an issue about the appalling abuses that Israel is meting out on a daily basis, human rights violations, international law violations, criticized by the UN. And yet we have, from the leader of the Labour Party across the chamber to the leader of the Conservative Party and all ports, really, in the House of Commons, barring one or two notable exceptions, seem very reluctant to speak out. And I was just asking the question, why is that, given that public opinion seems to be recognised that Israel is a basically a rogue state?
There are two answers I would offer, Chris. One is the long view. Every anti-colonial struggle in the past, when white people went into Kenya, stole all the best land for white farmers, drove out the black people from the very best land, the people who fought back, they called themselves the Land and Freedom Army. They kind of objected to British people coming and taking all the best land, just as we might do if Africans or Chinese came to Britain and tried that. But they were demonized. You know, they were called the Mau Mau. They didn't call themselves that. And I think every single anti-colonial struggle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm told that the English word for cannibal is derived from Caribs. And a Spanish conquistador says, we call them cannibals because they defend their villages very stoutly and they don't want to be dispossessed. Every anti-colonial struggle has been demonized, and the Palestinians are no exception. But the additional argument is, and I think here's the hope, you may remember the Israeli ambassador to Britain called Ron Prosor. He was promoted to become ambassador at the UN. And before he left, he wrote a very important article in the Daily Telegraph. I mean, it's full of rubbish about common democratic values. But he says, look, he compared Britain to a high-rise building. And he said, in the penthouse, relations are fine with corporate Britain, with the government and so on. But every other level of the building, he says, is filled with toxic anti-Israel hostility, by which he meant we know what they're up to. He basically said before he left, he was worried that intensified popular hostility to what Israel was doing could cause problems for state-to-state relations. And I think that's what BDS is all about. We need to build it up to such a level of intensity that it does hamper the sale of sniper rifle parts to the Israeli army, sweetheart deals with the EU, and so on. So I think Prosor left, and he's an intelligent, a cynical and deviant, an intelligent ambassador. He's doing his job. He's saying, look, there's going to be trouble if this tension between popular opinion and public policy continues. And he basically said it can't go on forever. And that's what we hope as well, Chris.
Right, yeah. Miko, what's your take on that point about the willingness of politicians to speak out? We know that's true in the States, just as it's true here, probably even to a greater extent, isn't it, in the States? I mean, it seems a very curious state of affairs given the level of public opinion, certainly in Europe and in the UK. What's the situation over there?
Well, in the United States, I mean, it's no secret. The United States has always been Israel's number one supporter, number one friend, so to speak. But there are changes. I mean, even in Congress, we see as of late there's a letter calling for, if not stopping, then at least slowing down military support for Israel if it does go ahead with the annexation. And, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez initiated it, and Bernie Sanders is signing on and so forth. We saw Eliot Engel just lose his, he was been in Congress forever. He is Israel's best friend. He just lost in the primary, and the man who's replacing him is a supporter of Palestinian rights and involved in Black Lives Matter and so forth. So there's a change. There's going to be a serious change when that comes up. But at the end of the day, what happens in the United States is this. the pro-Israeli groups are entrenched. I mean, they work on the local level. They work within the local school system, the public school system. They've got people watching the textbooks that are taught in social studies and history classes and so forth. They go in and they demand edits and they demand changes. This is across the entire United States. Yeah. I just did a panel discussion on that. I'm doing another one later this afternoon with experts on this issue and activists. And so they are on a local level so effective that really by the time you get to discussing this with politicians, they've learned about, they've been indoctrinated in school, they've been indoctrinated in the churches and the synagogues and so forth. Thankfully, the mosques are not indoctrinated in that way, so that's a good thing here in America. But by the time you talk to politicians, they've been indoctrinated for so many years, by and large, that Israel is right and the Arabs are wrong, Jews are right and Muslims are wrong, and so forth. That it's a very serious challenge. Now, we saw there have been some serious changes here in America since the murder of George Floyd. You know, everybody watched these horrifying 8 minutes and 46 seconds where the man's life was squeezed out of him by a police officer in uniform in broad daylight. And many people are now making that connection and saying, well, this is exactly what's happening in Palestine. And what will be the moment, the George Floyd moment, where politicians in America and in the UK, for that matter, and elsewhere, rise up and say, okay, enough is enough. We can't handle this anymore.
Interesting on that point, Miko, if I could just cut across you there.
Yeah.
Long Bailey, who was the shadow education secretary, the Labour shadow education secretary, was sacked from her role by the leader, Sir Keir Starmer, for sharing an article that made that connection that you're talking about.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, we saw you and I saw together the last few Labour Party conferences. It seemed like they looked like pro-Palestine rallies. I mean, in the main hall, everybody was carrying a Palestinian flag. And then we saw what happened in the last elections. We know what happened to you, what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, and the entire Labour Party really is completely crashed. And the man who claims that he was responsible for this, Gilad Erdan, who was the Minister for Strategic Affairs, is now coming to the United States as ambassador to Washington to continue this, good work and apply what he knows here in the United States, arguably. So it's a tough battle, and they have a huge advantage because, number one, nobody wants to see their career collapse. They don't want to see what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, what happened to you, what happened to the Labour Party happened to them. So there's a threat there. There's a warning there. That's number one. And number two, people have been indoctrinated for so long by the press, by the press, the media in general, again, in school books. It's as simple as that. In high school social studies classes, that basically there's a good side and a bad side. We stand with the good, we stand with the Jews, we stand with the Israelis. And what they bring to the table that the other colonialists didn't have is this Jewish history, is the Holocaust, is this whole weight of, carrying the weight of Jewish history and Jewish suffering in Europe and so forth. And they are cynically using this, of course, and you know this very well. They cynically use this in order to excuse and justify and apologize for what Israel is doing, to say, well, we have, the special dispensation for us because we're Jews and we suffered. At the same time, there is a
in this country, or certainly the Labour Party, he gets expelled for alleged anti-Semitism. I'm just told though, Miko, if I may cut across you there, that Issa Amro has joined us. And, I'd just like to, if I may, bring him in if he is online. I'm told he's there. Are you there, Issa?
Yes, I am there.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I introduced you at the top of the program before you were online with us. So if it's okay with you, it'd be good if you could maybe just say a few words by way of introduction. I've already explained that you are a youth worker. You live in the West Bank, I believe, and you're a peace campaigner, and were inspired, I believe, by people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. So I wonder if you could perhaps give us your thoughts about the latest Israeli plans for annexation and what's life like really on the ground in Palestine at the moment.
Yes. Thank you very much for organizing this, Chris. Thanks to all of you for what are you doing for Palestine. I think it's very important not to lose the hope and go on with our non-violence resistance against the occupation and against apartheid and against any kind of racism all over the world. Palestinians now are very disappointed. They feel that they are stuck with the, with an annexation plan, with what is happening on the ground from the Israeli military and from the Israeli settlers, especially that they are using the COVID-19 breakout very well. They know that the world is busy, to protect, the humanity, and the Israeli settlers are busy trying to take more land and trying to attack Palestinians and make their life harder and harder. From the beginning of this year, we were suffering a lot from the Israeli settlers and from the Israeli occupation. About annexation, Palestinians are really don't know what to do, especially because of the gathering restrictions, because of the COVID-19 virus. On the other hand, Palestinians don't trust the PA leadership, and they don't trust their measures against the Israeli occupation. Palestinians, they want unity, they want a real resistance program, they want a vision for the future, they want to say no to Oslo Accord, they want to say no to the occupation, security, coordination, but they don't see that the PA is very serious about that. Annexation means more apartheid, more land theft, more removal of the Palestinian identity, even within West Bank. From my opinion, it's the third Palestinian Nakba, 48, 67, and now 2020. They want to steal more land and to steal more, let me say, Palestinian rights. It's about that they're trying to say that it's an only 30%, but the occupation is there. The apartheid is there. And annexation is part of the apartheid and the occupation in West Bank. And that means we are closer to the one-state solution that we ask for, for equal rights for everybody. And, that's now what we should start doing as Palestinians. But how Palestinians and the international community should analyze what happens in the future, Hebrewnizing all over West Bank. The closed streets, the closed markets, the double standards in the city, 2 sets of law in the same area, one for the settlers and one against the Palestinians. This is what will happen. Chris, you were in Hebron and you saw the segregation and the separation. I think that model, the occupation is taking it all over, West Bank and all over, the areas they want to annex to Israel, which means that more displacement for the Palestinians, which means more, more water shortage, much less rights in all levels, much less basic rights. But Palestinians are angry. Palestinians are waiting to see steps on the ground to decide what to do exactly about the annexation announcement, because Israel is already annexing and the settlements. The settlers in Hebron, in the middle of West Bank, are under the Israeli civil law, but they want to legitimize this, presence in the West Bank, and they want the international community, the UN, the US administration, the European countries, to legitimize the settlements presence in the West Bank. So even the small steps, which was taken by the EU, for example, of labeling the settlement goods, will not be valid anymore, because they are talking about settlement goods. In the other hand, it's part of Israel. So what is a settlement and what is not a settlement, Israel is deciding, and they already managed to decide since long time what is a settlement and what is not a settlement. And Miko says it's all the same. I say that according to the international law, we had 1967, borders. Now they don't respect the borders. They don't respect anything, any agreement, and any international consensus. And as Palestinian activists and as pro-Palestinian cause, we should update our strategies, and we should talk about that we as Palestinians and the pro-Palestinian parties, that we do a kind of modify our work, do reform to our work, and try to evaluate our resistance since 1948.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of your lectures that you've given, Issa, about the routine brutality that is meted out by the Israeli Defense Force. I wonder if you could give viewers a sense of the kind of brutality that you've witnessed, where we've seen settlers just turning up. One video that I saw recently that you'd posted, Israeli settlers just intimidating Palestinians in their own home, turning up fully armed with soldiers in tow as well. I've seen some of the other video evidence that you've captured of people being shot and wounded, Palestinians, and left without medical treatment. I mean, this is so horrific, and I think just beyond the ability, really, I think, of people in this country to kind of compute, to understand. I mean, I wonder if you could maybe just bring that to life for us a little bit. What's it like living with that on a daily basis, and just perhaps if you could give some of the examples of some of the appalling incidents that you yourself have witnessed.
I witnessed many attacks from the Israeli settlers. Me personally, I got 5 stitches, 3 stitches on the head. I was attacked physically last year more than 8 times. I have life threats from the Israeli settlers. Not only me, all the Palestinian human rights defenders are in jail or attacked or threatened or isolated or in a way or another separated from their own society and their own communities. So the Israeli occupation, they try to put you down by letting the settlers attack you, use violence against you. Let me give you an example of what happened from the beginning of this year in Hebron. Updates. In our center in Tel Rumeda, which is also my personal house, we documented on video cameras more than 15 attacks by stealing our construction materials, our metals, damaging our doors, cutting our fence, damaging our walls, uprooting our trees, throwing stones toward our house, hitting up the activists when they were documenting the Israeli settler violence. Why all of that? Because the Israeli settlers in Hebron, who live a few meters far from our houses, are under the Israeli civilian law, and we as Palestinians, we are under the Israeli military law, which means that we are not allowed to do any kind of general assembly. So non-violence resistance is not allowed. Any kind of peaceful protesting is not allowed according to the Israeli military law. I am facing 16 military charges, and the most recent update from my military trial, the Israeli military trial, that the prosecution, without surprising me, asked that I should be convicted with all the 16 military charges, baseless charges. It's only soldiers lying or saying, they said their let me say testimonies about an incident happened 2010. Do you think that it's valid testimony about 2010? This kind of lies from the Israeli, but because the system give them all that power to put me in jail without any kind of really fair trial. On the other hand, the Israeli settlers who attacked my house and our center in Tel Rumeda with their faces not covered, I filed a complaint to the Israeli police with faces, with names, with witnesses from the Israeli army, not defense forces for sure. It's Israeli military and Israeli occupation forces, and from the Israeli police witnesses. They closed the case against the Israeli settlers who did damages, who attacked our house after 10 days. So the settlers, they don't have any kind of accountability. On the other hand, the streets in Hebron are segregated. I'm not allowed to walk in my own streets. I'm not allowed to open my own shops. So my house where I was born in the old city of Hebron, is closed. It's a military zone. So I'm not allowed as a Palestinian, Issa and other Palestinians are the same. We are not allowed to visit our houses or to come back to live in our houses in Hebron. So annexation, we are not allowed to reach, our schools without passing many, many checkpoints. Imagine that we have 22 checkpoints in 1 kilometer square in Hebron, more than 1,000 Palestinian apartment became empty, which is 43% of the housing units. And this is what will happen to the annexed areas in Jordan Valley, that the Palestinians will be forced, to leave their homes, their communities, because of the harassment and the inequality and the injustice. It's structural inequality against the Palestinians. This is what is happening in Hebron. We try as Palestinians not to give up or coexist with the Israeli occupation or the Israeli military, or afraid of the Israeli settler violence or complaints or false accusation of any kind of terrorist or anti-Semite or anything they accuse us. We try to stay strong, to document the human rights violations of the Israeli settlers by using the most trustful witness, which is the video camera, increase the capacity of our society, our community, especially the women and the youth, to stay strong and remain steadfast against the Israeli occupation, and to do advocacy and try to reach the Palestinian, Palestinian diaspora, the Palestinian the Palestinian activists outside Palestine, the pro-Palestinian cause activists, to post Palestinian voices from grassroots level. This is what we try to do, but we will not give up our rights. We will continue fighting the Israeli occupation and the Israeli injustice and the Israeli segregation till we get our full rights. We want full rights in our own country. That's all what we want as Palestinians.
Well, listen, Issa, you're an absolute inspiration to us, I've got to say. And I don't know if you have a message for anything else you would like supporters in the UK to be doing to support you. Is there any message you would like to give to supporters in the UK about anything more that they could do to assist your campaign for justice?
Yes, for sure. I want to say that we see a lot of solidarity activities in the UK for the Palestinian rights. I want to thank everybody who's working for Palestine, for the justice in Palestine, for the Palestinian human rights. That is amazing. We feel stronger. We feel more protected as human rights defenders who are facing, daily the Israeli settler violence and the Israeli, occupation, brutal forces against us. So we want to thank them for any kind of solidarity, any kind of protesting. It makes us stronger. Any kind of, webinars, seminars, all of these actions, which is visible against the occupation, against the injustice in Palestine, is really, really important. What I want the people in Britain to do, that, to increase awareness in their communities, in their societies, in their mosques, in their churches, in their synagogues, all over UK, speak about Palestine, speak about the injustice, and write to your representatives, write to the MPs, ask them what measures they are doing, what they are doing to stop annexation, what they are doing to stop apartheid in Palestine, what they are doing to stop the Israeli occupation and the Israeli injustice against the Palestinians. And we want media, to observe the media, observe what is written in the media, and try to make campaigns against the media, and for sure to be very smart how to make the occupation really more expensive. And how we make the occupation more expensive, everybody is really should be creative about that. You have the BDS campaign doing amazing work. You have Amnesty, they have banned settlement goods campaign, they are doing amazing work. You have the UN published the blacklist of the factories and the companies which is investing in the Israeli settlements. That is really, real concrete steps against the Israeli occupation. People should be engaged in one of these kind of concrete actions against the Israeli occupation and against the Israeli injustice in Palestine. Only, condemning the occupation, is good, but it's not enough. We want a real accountability, a real, price to be paid by Israel for what they are doing. Israel is really doing all these violations to the international law, to the basic human rights law, because of the accountability. They are not accountable. They don't have any kind of impunity, unfortunately. So we should speak, about accountability and to take off the impunity. Something else very important. We have many, many Israeli settler violent leaders. Why they are allowed to come into Europe? Why the Israeli price tag campaigns is not a terrorist organization in UK till now? So we should, work on that to make, as Meir Kahana Kah movement was announced by the UK as a terrorist organization, and Meir Kahane was not allowed to come into UK, Baruch Marzel and his supporters, Itamar bin Nigver and Mikhail bin Ari, all those figures of the Israeli settlers should not be, allowed in UK. Lieberman, Bennett, all the leaders who are really, calling to kill Palestinians every morning and every day, and they are just making our life harder and harder. They should not be welcome in the UK, and we should work to impose them, to expose them, and to make them accountable for their human rights violations.
Well, hopefully this is some comfort, and I'm sure this message that I've just had on YouTube from one of our many viewers this evening said a message to you to say that we all love you. Please stay strong, Issa. So I think the person that sent that message speaks for millions of British people, and we'll continue to do obviously what we can to raise the Palestinian struggle and the abuses that the Israeli state is perpetrating, and continue to make the case for equal rights for the Palestinian people. It's basic human rights, and I'm astonished, frankly, that we aren't seeing louder and stronger voices from the politicians in some of the countries around the world whose populations are overwhelmingly sympathetic, but regrettably some of the political voices are muted. And it's up to us, therefore, it seems to me, on the ground, because these people are supposed to be our representatives, to bring pressure to bear to make sure that they actually represent the views of the people that put them into those elected assemblies in the first place. But I wonder if I just bring in Miko, just picking up on some of the points that Issa was making there. I mean, what he is setting out very clearly, and you're over in the States, I believe, at the moment, and you'll be familiar with segregation in the States. And of course, the Black Lives Matter campaign has really taken off there now. But I mean, what Issa is just explaining there and setting out in very clear detail, it's segregation writ large, isn't it? And this is something that I think the vast majority of people would have thought, in the modern era, in the 21st century, is complete anathema. And how on earth is it allowed to continue? And how on earth is it the fact that, as we were saying before we brought Issa into the show, that so many politicians are muted and don't call this out? This is absolutely beyond the pale. It's outrageous. It's despicable. It's disgusting. And yet this is happening to human beings on a daily basis. People, as I've said, on both sides of the chamber and the House of Commons are not speaking out loudly enough. And obviously we need to redouble our efforts, I guess, to make sure that they do represent the views of the public. But just on that point about segregation, I mean, this is absolutely segregation writ large, isn't it? Jim Crow.
Well, absolutely, and the way Issa described it, the Hebronization of Palestine. This is Hebron. Anybody who's been there, comes out shocked, and especially if you've met Issa and have done the tour with him, and you've been to his center, the Youth Against Settlement, and you've seen the absolutely tremendous work that they do. It's shocking because it is so apparent and it is so clear. That on the one side you've got good people who just want to live their lives in this Palestinian town, which is Hebron, and then you've got these lunatic settlers. And Issa mentioned Meir Kahane. Meir Kahane was a symbol of Jewish terrorism, and I think he was banned from visiting many countries. And his students are now in the Knesset. Naftali Bennett and Bezalel Smotrich and all of these people who are members of the Knesset, members of the Israeli cabinet, they speak with the exact same voice, using the exact same terminology and the same ideology as Meir Kahane. It has become mainstream. But look, you look over Palestine, people rarely talk about the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, but there's terrible segregation there too. I mean, when you look at the Nakab Desert makes up half of the southern half of the country. You have hundreds of thousands, over 200,000 Palestinian Bedouin who live in towns without electricity, without access to water, without access to medical care, without the access that Jewish settlers who live across the street from them. Of course, they're not called settlers because the Nakab is considered, Israel proper, but they are all settlers. who live, with the finest with finest conditions one could ever expect, of a pure, fully developed country, one across the street from the other. So the apartheid and the segregation and the lack of rights for Palestinians goes across the board. Certainly, East Jerusalem is the same way. Although they live under slightly different laws, the Palestinians who have this quasi-Israeli citizenship, the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, the Palestinians who live like Issa in Hebron, they live under slightly different laws, but the segregation, the racism, denial of water, denial of rights, constant following by the Israeli security services, constant home demolition, constant taking away of their lands, constantly denying them the right to build so that they can develop and expand, taking their land so that their communities have to grow and remain crowded, is across the country, is across the whole thing. And you said, in the beginning, in the introduction, about how this was basically an apartheid state, a racist endeavor from the very beginning. And they didn't even try to hide it. In other words, the laws that apply to me within the Israeli legal system are very, very different. And not to mention the reality in which somebody like me lives in Israel, within Israeli society and within Israeli law, is entirely different than what a Palestinian lives, even if they have an Israeli citizenship. So in terms of the fact that what is happening is in Hebron, what is happening in East Jerusalem, what is happening in the Negev, what is happening in the Galilee and other parts of Palestine, in Jaffa, this is all part of the same thing. It is a corrupt, racist, violent regime that has taken over Palestine and is now taken one more step. And they're going to, precisely like I said, they're going to Hebronize the entire Jordan River Valley and make life even more difficult and more impossible for the Palestinians who live there, if they're even allowed to remain. Because once the land's taken, the Palestinians quite often are forced to leave and go into God knows where, refugee camps or whatever. So this is very, very serious, and it is segregated. Israel has never hidden the fact that the laws that govern the lives of Jews and the laws that govern the lives of what they call others, which are, of course, the Palestinians, are not meant to be the same.
No. I mean, the segregation, it seems to me, is far worse that the Palestinians are being subjected to than the black population in the States were being subjected to, right up to the 60s and the passing of this civil rights legislation that was supposed to, as it were, bring that to an end. But I wonder if I could bring in Mick, actually, because I've had a question here, Mick, from Sarah Wilkinson, who's saying, how can we be more effective? I think that's probably an appropriate question to you, given your involvement in the Palestine Solidarity campaign.
I think my starting point would be that obviously we have to educate people about the horrors that Issa has described. And he's only scratched the surface. I think it's a huge challenge to convey to British people the nature of the regime, the day-to-day life of what our government supports, and not only supports politically, diplomatically, but even militarily. To convey that is difficult. So, for example, how can we talk about the orgy of destruction of Palestinian homes and the building of exclusive Jewish-only settlements side by side? It's in your face. There's nothing hidden. I mean, in terms of the comparison with South Africa, it may have been Tutu, or it was some other huge figure in this liberation movement who said that compared to what the Palestinians are going through, what they went through in the liberation struggle in South Africa, and I remember it and thinking it was dark and horrible and murderous, people being killed in large numbers. But he said, compared to what the Palestinians are going through, it was a picnic. Now that image sticks in your mind. It's a quantum leap of much, much worse, much more hideous apartheid. Ronnie Kasrils, a Jewish veteran of the liberation struggle, he said, look, don't call what the Palestinians are living in Bantustans. The Bantustans in South Africa never were walled in. They were never bombed from the air. They never had a curfew for 6 months. They had a curfew sometimes for 3 days. And the lives of Palestinians compared to the lives of black people in South Africa, and you don't want to minimize what happened there, but it's vastly worse, vastly worse. Can I just make the point I was going to make, Chris, was how do you describe how Palestinians have their homes bulldozed? Well, you can take the example of they sometimes get a bill from the Israeli government, sorry, an order, you must destroy your own home, or we will give you a thumping big bill if we do it, 30 or whatever. Now that's pretty degenerate to make somebody destroy his own home. But what do you do about a guy called Faisal Abu Baniya? And it was 2018, I think. The Israelis made him destroy his own home on his wedding day. Now, you have to think about that. That's the life of Palestinians. And, you know, if one theory explains it, Israel operates full spectrum, making life as miserable as possible creatively for Palestinians, because the dream is that they will leave and make way for Zionist Jews coming in. To be effective, I think we have to say, look, that's the horror. Palestinians resist, and we know they will continue to resist. But, you know, people already have a sense that something's terribly wrong. There's not a lot of support at grassroots level for Israel in this country. By the way, a majority of MPs in Scotland have just voted for that early day motion 529 to support the Sumaran family who are going to be evicted onto the streets of Jerusalem. Not too many Labour MPs have signed it, unfortunately, UK-wide. But, you know, they're responding. They're not brave politicians. They're responding to public opinion. And I think what we need to do is say this, look, if we are decisive in our action, if we disrupt, if we put our bodies on the line, if we go beyond the narrow confines of the law, you know the guys in Bay, Chris, they smashed up the arms factory during Israel's invasion of Lebanon. You know the guys in Brighton, they smashed up the arms factory, £250,000 worth of damage during Operation Cast Lead. When they go to court, juries in both cases found them unanimously not guilty. And they said, look, in Derry, they said, what do you do if you're passing by a door and behind it you hear a child being abused? Is the door private property? Smash the door down. It's your duty to protect that child, to prevent a greater crime. The rights of private property are not sacred. And so they smashed up the arms factories in Derry and Brighton, and the juries unanimously found them not guilty. That's a fantastic referendum. So I think, to answer your question, we have to be courageous. We have to be brave. We have to recognise that when we talk about increment, we talk about genocide in Gaza, it's not hyperbole. And our response must be commensurate. We have to get large numbers of people with us, but we also have to say, if we stick our necks out, we'll win. Public opinion will be with us, I'm sure of it. And I think that's what the record shows.
Well, you've certainly set a great example, Mick. I've seen some of the publicity about some of the direct action that you've taken, highlighting the involvement of British companies, as I was saying at the outset, involvement in supporting the settler, the illegal settlements, and that's a great example, it seems to me, to follow. And we need more of that sort of action, because, like with many things, really, to get the change that we want to bring about, it has to be demanded from below. If we wait for those at the top to hand it down, we'll be waiting a very long time. And it is incredibly disappointing to me that so few MPs, you see, it's kind of got worse, actually, because I mean, people like Gerald Kaufman spoke out very bravely on this matter. And frankly, if he spoke out in the way in which he did, I shared a speech he made a few years before he died. If he made that kind of speech today, it's almost certain that he would be suspended and expelled from the Labour Party. They're an elder statesman of the Labour Party with a fine record, and he was a practicing Jew, wasn't he? You know.
Sure.
And,
absolutely, it's wonderful.
Very happy. As we know, many people in the Jewish community are solidly behind the Palestinian people, but regrettably, they are also targeted and abused and smeared. And
it's not as bad as we think, you know. One of our people went to a meeting with a rabbi in Edinburgh a couple of years ago. They were talking about solidarity, and somebody asked the rabbi, what's it like when you have discussions in your congregation on Israel, Palestine? She said we can't have discussions. We would need a referee because the opinion is so polarized.
Yeah.
I would build on, if I may, just make one more point, Chris, before you kick me out. I would build on what Issa said, Issa Amro. I'm moved deeply when he says what you do has an impact in Palestine. You know, I think Muslims go to Mecca and Catholics go to Lourdes. If I was religious, I would go to Dunn's store in Dublin, because that's where the women went on strike in order to black South African goods, if you remember. It led to a year-long strike. And when you read the memoirs of the liberation movement leaders, they said, you know, that reached into Robben Island prison. When the movement was being smashed militarily and things were at a low ebb, suddenly they said, what's this? What's this going on in Ireland? These women, these men, trade unionists are going on strike for us. And it changed the balance between the screws and the prisoners. The prisoners became more confident. And the supporters of apartheid, their confidence was diminished. I think Dunn's, sending a message to Palestine to maintain morale and to damage the morale of the Zionist bloc, I think that's what we are trying to do.
No, and more power to your elbow. And I think, as I say, it's a real kind of example to all of us. And we shouldn't underestimate, really, I think, the importance of that. And Issa made that clear that, that is valued and appreciated by the Palestinian people, to see the level of solidarity. But I wonder if I could just bring Issa back in now, if I may, if he's still there, Issa. We've had a question from one of our viewers, Diane Drew. She's saying just recently she found an article stating that holiday villas were being built on ex-Palestinian land. And she's just asking the question, I don't know if you know the answer to this, Issa. She's asking the question, what percentage of reclaimed land has been used to build holiday villas and second homes? Are you there, Issa, still? I think we may have lost Issa. I wonder if Miko, whether you might be able to pick up on that one. If Miko's there.
Well, I haven't heard. What I know about that is that groups like Airbnb and some of the others work within the settlements in the West Bank, and they advertise the homes for people to come and have a holiday there. Which is really cynical, because these are, when you drive along the West Bank, you see clearly, you see the Palestinian towns, and then quite literally across the street, you'll see these villas, these European-looking villas with red roofs and then green lawns and so on, built on Palestinian land. And Airbnb and I believe Expedia and maybe some of the others that advertise these vacation homes have been, and there's been a call to boycott them as well because of that. I don't know much of that. Have been hotels or anything like that, but I think that's the reference. The reference is mostly to people going out on vacation, an Airbnb type of thing, where you go into somebody's home, and they are and to see they have their own special advertising platforms. And when you read the way they describe these homes, the way they describe the biblical views, the paths and the hills where Jacob walked and David fought in battle and Samson did this or that or the other, it's appealing to a very particular kind of demographic. And yes, they operate there, and they pretend like they live in normal communities. They pretend like they live in these normal suburban kind of communities. They're gated communities, of course, always gated. There's high security. They are built into, so like fortresses, so they always look inside. But as you drive along the apartheid roads from which Issa is denied, to which Issa, people like Issa are denied access, they see these lovely villas on the one hand, and then they see the olive groves, and they see the vineyards, and they see all this beautiful Palestinian West Bank landscape. And who wouldn't want to vacation there? I mean, it's gorgeous. If you just ignore everything else, then it is a beautiful, beautiful landscape. It's a beautiful country. But that is, I believe, what
people are asking for, as I understand it, is equal right. I mean, let's live in harmony. Let's sort of, have our land back, and let's, be treated as human beings. And the 21st century, that is the bare minimum that we should be demanding, isn't it? I would have thought.
Yes, well, if you talk to, Issa, other Palestinian friends of mine, when you sit and talk, people, what do they want? They want to go to Jerusalem and pray, and they want to go to the beach and take their kids to the beach from time to time. They want to go and travel around the country freely without having to be stopped. That's all this is about. This is not about some kind of a military takeover. It's not about destroying, expelling. It's about simple things. It's a drive. For Issa to go to Jerusalem shouldn't take more than half an hour. He needs to wait, months to get a permit or to break the law and try to go, and violating the law and risk himself being caught and going to prison. It's absurd. If he wants to take his son to the beach, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. And you're never that far from the beach in Palestine or to see the Jordan River or anything like that. It is absolutely impossible. That is what Palestinians are asking for. It's just like you said, normalcy, a normal life, to be able to do the things that we all take for granted.
Yes, the sort of things, absolutely, the sort of things that we do absolutely take for granted. And it's such a beautiful country to be treated, for people that their homeland, to be treated in that way in their own homeland. It's just so appalling. And just on that point, I'm just interested whether you could maybe comment as well, Miko, about this so-called right to return to Israel, to Palestine, for people who've never been there in their lives. And yet the Palestinian people, this is something that, for Jewish people, as I understand it, a right to return. I know people like Jackie Walker, a good friend of mine, who was expelled from the Labour Party, a black Jewish woman, ironically, who was a very big supporter of the Palestinian people. And I remember hearing Jackie speak, saying she has more right to return to a place she's never been and never has an intention of going to than people that have 1,000 years of ancestry. What do you think about that? I mean, how can that be reconciled? This so-called right to return, and how that
it's
the Palestinian people.
They use this argument that Jewish people get special dispensation because of their suffering, and so immediately when the state of Israel was established, they established what they call the law of return, which basically says that any Jew that wants to come to become a citizen can become a citizen. They have to still go through some processes, but basically they have a right to come because the land belongs to the Jewish people. That is the basic premise of Zionism. It is the land of Israel. It belongs to the Jewish people. And the Palestinians, the Arabs, are just, they're invaders, they're transients, they're of no consequence. And therefore we have a right to kick them out and take our land back. Because the argument is that we lived there 2,000 years ago. Never mind the fact that we have not been there for 2,000 years, but we were there 2,000 years ago, and therefore we have this right to return. And like you said, Palestinians who live in refugee camps all around in Palestine sometimes, and in the countries around Palestine, do not have the right. And that is the other law that was passed immediately when the state of Israel was established, that Palestinian refugees do not have a right to return. So Jews all over the place who have nothing to do with Palestine have a right to come and become citizens. Palestinians who have a history, like you said, of sometimes up to 1,000 years, have no right to come back. And this is even more acute if we're talking about Jerusalem. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I've been living in America for a long time. I can go back tomorrow, and if I had a house, I can keep my house, I can get my job, I have my rights, my citizenship, and so forth. A Palestinian Jerusalemite who leaves to go to school, if they're gone for more than a certain period of time, it used to be 3 years, they change it all the time, they lose their status. Now, to begin with, they're not citizens. To begin with, these Palestinians who sometimes have a history going back in Jerusalem of 500 or 1,000 years do not have citizenship. They are alien residents. And if they leave, they lose their property and they lose their status, so they can no longer come back, other than if they want to come back as tourists. And whereas I, as an Israeli, who have a history there of exactly 1.5 generations, I'm a citizen. I can go back anytime I wish and live there and have family there. And if I had property, I could keep it and so forth. So the laws are completely separate. And you've got, on the one hand, the law of return, which applies to Jews. And then you've got the right of return, which is denied Palestinians, even though, sometimes they live just miles away, a few short miles away from the land from which they were kicked out. The Palestinians in Gaza, for example, close to 1 million refugees, live just maybe an hour away from the lands that used to belong to them, where they used to live. And so that is, it's an absolutely absurd proposition to say that Palestinians do not have a right to return. The right of return of the refugees is absolutely fundamental part of the Palestinian struggle, of the right of Palestinians in general, and there can be no movement at all on the issue of Palestine without that being, an application of the right to return. In other words, not just accepting it, but actually working to apply so that the Palestinian refugees can return to their land and be compensated and be paid reparations for 7 decades of dispossession. I mean, their lands have been used, their homes have been used for something. Somebody's used them. Somebody has used their land for agriculture, or their home for a hotel. They need to pay back. So all of this has to be resolved as part of the larger solution, without a doubt.
I've just had a question come in, which is directed directly at you, Miko. It's asking if Miko could say a bit more about the Jewish National Fund.
Oh, the Jewish National Fund. Growing up as a Zionist in a Zionist family, the Jewish National Fund was always spoken about with such love and with such respect and with such regard and with such admiration. And, there were always somebody who was somebody's friend or relative who's the head of the Jewish National Fund, and, all the work that they do to help Jews and bring Jews and reclaim the land and so forth. But basically, I can't even find the words to describe how horrifying the work of this organization is, because they are perhaps the #1 most dedicated organization to displacing Palestinians and then reusing their land for anything from forests to building for Jews to, whatever it is the state of Israel wants it to do. But they are they have been on the forefront of the ethnic cleansing, the stealing of lands. And it goes on, to this day, even with Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who have lands. And I spoke about the Nakab earlier, the southern part of the country, the southern part of Palestine. Even to this day, they are kicking out Palestinians, destroying Palestinian homes, destroying Palestinian towns, because the Jewish National Fund wants to build plant a forest, whether it's a forest in the name of this or a forest in the name of that. And a good mutual friend of ours, Jack Thomas and I were, we visited there, and we saw the remains of this village. There used to be a thriving Palestinian town, and now has been destroyed to build some forest or other. So they have been at the forefront of the destruction of Palestine, the rebuilding, so to speak, of this greater Israel that maybe once existed 3,000 years ago. And they are a criminal organization from start to finish.
Yeah. I think, thank you, Mika. I think Issa's back. Are you with us, Issa, again?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, hi, Issa. Yeah, I've just had a couple of questions actually, which are directed to you, if you're able to answer them. One from Adam Clifford, and he's asking this: would the Palestinian people be prepared to live in one state if it was called Israel?
For sure, no. Palestinians are not ready to live in an apartheid state. We see how Israel is treating the Druze who are serving even in the Israeli army. Ghassan Aliyan was the head of Golani Brigade, and he was, one of the main leaders of the war against the people in Gaza. Netanyahu told him that Israel is not for him. Israel is only for the Jews. And Ghassan Aliyan, who is who works against the Palestinian rights, he told him that he should go to Gaza or to go to live in Syria. So we as Palestinians, we want to live in Palestine. We want our identity. In Palestine, we accept all nationalities and all, let me say, religions. I don't see any. I never asked Miko, what is your religion? And he never asked me, Issa, what is your religion? It's an old style to ask about religions. And, we all respect each other's religion and beliefs. And, and if we are secular or we are religious, it doesn't matter. It's about international law. It's about our, belief in humanity and human rights and equality and justice and freedom for everybody. I don't want freedom only for myself. I want
No.
freedom for everybody in the world, even not only in Palestine. So we as Palestinians, I don't think you will find any Palestinian will accept to live in Israel as a second-class citizen or a third-class citizen.
So, I mean, essentially then, I mean, for me, it seems that the only viable solution in reality would be a one-state solution with equal rights for everybody. Is that your position, Issa, or do you think a two-state solution could work?
I can say that I am with ending the occupation and with freedom and with justice and making Israel accountable for its occupation for that long. I can say that, you know, I was really saying that we should give an opportunity to any just solution according to the Palestinian consensus and according to the Palestinian, that we do a kind of a survey, you know, for all Palestinians who are living in Palestine and outside Palestine. But I see that Israel is only now leaving one-state solution for for what they are doing on the ground. But it doesn't mean that I accept settlements on 1967 borders, you know, or, you know, annexation or any kind of something like that. Because some people will say, let's do two-state solution and keep the settlements in Hebron, or keep the settlements in Bethlehem, or let's keep the settlements in Jordan Valley. No, settlements in one-state solution or two-state solution are illegal and must be dismantled.
Yes, no, indeed. Thank you. Mick, if we bring Mick back now, there's a question from Adam Clifford again, and he's asking if there is an easy way of recognizing Israeli state-occupied territories' products.
No. The answer is emphatically no. I remember some years ago, Cyprus, which is today quite closely allied with Israel, but Cyprus complained about, it was either Lowe's or Aldi's, everybody, you'll forgive me for not remembering in detail, but Cyprus complained that Israel was relabeling its potatoes as Cyprus potatoes. And it tells you something, that Cyprus did not want that stigma attached to their product. The Israelis are very good at putting a plaque on a wall in Tel Aviv and saying that a settlement product is actually from Tel Aviv. And, you know, Netanyahu has made it, I think, a crime, or he's certainly made it, I think he's made it illegal to distinguish between goods from the occupied territories after 67 and goods from 48, 67 Israel. It's impossible to tell. And you know something? Why should you tell? The Green Line is increasingly a fiction. You know, if a mad dog is attacking your friend, you don't try to pull out its teeth, or you'd have to give it a kicking. You have to respond to the attack in a way that deters the attack. Now, we're non-violent. I use kicking metaphorically. We have to marshal our resources in order to deter Israel from continuing to do what it's doing. But the short answer is no. I mean, the main, you know, I have a problem with people who draw up a long list of items coming from the occupied territories, which are then boycottable. I don't buy anything Israeli, and I think it's great that people don't. But no, there's two different notions of boycott. One is the consumer boycott. And we'll really not know for a very long time how successful or unsuccessful that is. I think it'll be successful. But a targeted boycott, which takes on Veolia, for example, for a particular crime in the occupied territories, and inflicts massive harm on Veolia internationally, from Stockholm to Sydney in Australia and so on, and makes it partially withdraw. These organised and collective boycott initiatives, I think that's what sends a message to Palestine. I mean, Issa is not going to get a message if you don't buy, Israeli peppers in Lidl's. It's good that you don't, but the signal comes when hundreds of, I do apologise, somebody's trying to, I think the signal reaches Israel when hundreds of people go to a football game or go to some sports event and Israel is ridiculed. And it becomes clear that Israel can put Palestinians in a I'll say the word ghetto, but internationally it's Israel which is in a ghetto, and people are repelled by what it does. So how do we send a message to Palestine? Ultimately, consumer boycotts build up. We've heard that the farmers in the Jericho Valley, Jordan Valley, are expressing serious concerns about losing market share in Europe, in key countries. So the consumer boycott's important. I would say much more important is to boycott and isolate the state of Israel. And you know, when Hotoveli comes as the ambassador, she will not be able to visit a single university in Britain without being vigorously challenged. Can I refer back to something that was said earlier about the possibilities for sending messages? Do people remember that Tzipi Livni had to cancel her talk for the Jewish National Fund in London a few years ago because there was an arrest warrant issued for her for war crimes during one of the massacres in Gaza? I think it was Doron Almog. His plane landed at Heathrow, and there was cops waiting for him in Heathrow at the terminal with handcuffs for this Israeli general for his war crimes. Somebody tipped him off, and the plane took off right away without him getting off at London. But even at that level, magistrates have been ready to issue arrest warrants for Lipney and Almog and others, and only frantic action by the British government has been able to protect these guys. So I think Lipney was given a ridiculous status as a diplomat, and she wasn't a diplomat. She was an ex-member of a government with no diplomatic status whatsoever, but the British had to protect her from British magistrates. I think that's telling something. I think that it's not just among trade unions and churches that there's a readiness to act against the Israeli criminals and send a message to our Palestinian comrades. There's a readiness even at the level of magistrates sometimes. And it can give us some hope in these very, very dark times, Chris.
No, indeed. And talking about sending a signal, I mean, a big shout out for the Celtic supporters, because they've made their support for the Palestinian cause very visible at matches, and that's been recorded, and I'm sure was a source of comfort in terms of the very visible solidarity being expressed in a very overt way at a major football match, with all the cameras there, and the international attention that brings. There's another message from Sarah Wilkinson, actually, who's a great pro-Palestinian activist, and it's a message to Issa saying, we'll never stop speaking out for the rights of the Palestinians and their inalienable right to return. We are in this for the long term and the whole duration. Our land, my solidarity is for life, she says. And that's a message directly to you, Issa. And I wonder if I could bring Issa in, actually. There's a question here. I think you did touch on this, Issa, in your opening remarks about the impact of COVID, from Mark Anderson. He's asking, do we know how badly the COVID crisis has been affecting the Palestinian people? Is Issa there still, or have we lost him again? Apologies. I think we've lost him. Yeah. I wonder if Miko, there's a question here about police forces from around the world, which I don't know if you know this, but obviously there's been some controversy about the murder of George Floyd, and then it was revealed that many police departments in the States had been trained by Israeli security services. And there's a question about what do we know, what other police departments elsewhere in the world have been trained by Israeli security services. Do you have an answer to that? Do you know? Obviously, we know about the American situation, but do we know about anywhere else in the world?
Well, we know that Israel has been training the police and the secret police and the security forces of practically every dark regime under the sun. Going all the way back to the Shah of Iran, Israel trained the Shavak. I think it was called the Shavak. The Shavak, that was his secret service. They used to torture people, and now are being used again by the way, the current regime in Iran, as far as I understand. But Israel has trained, you name it. I mean, all the Latin American dictatorships had Israeli trainers. I know, both military, police, secret police. But the case here in the United States, this is an actually sponsored program, sponsored by this rabid pro-Zionist racist group called the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which is really dedicated to defamation of Arabs and Muslims, but pretends to be a civil rights organization. And they sponsor quite a lot. They foot quite a bit of the bill, and they make sure that almost every police chief of every city in America goes to visit Israel to go through the indoctrination. And then they organize the training, whether they have Israelis come here and train them, or they have members of police forces go over there and are trained there. And it all stems from this idea that, number one, Israel is facing terrorism and is doing a good job in curbing terrorism. Now, Israel has never faced terrorism. Israel has faced Palestinian resistance, which has never been terrorism. And Palestinians have never had the means, really. They've never had a military force. They've never had serious weapons. In other words, they've never really posed any kind of threat against Israel. And so this myth is built on this, very sophisticated, very intelligent security force that Israel has, and that they know how to deal with terrorism, which of course is a myth, because there's no terrorism and there's no ability to fight it. They're talking about massive force against the people who have never had a military. And the terrorists that they describe are people like Issa. Those are the terrorists, really. And so therefore, and I believe this began after 9/11, there was this need to go and learn from the experts. And of course, the experts were the Israelis. And it developed more and more and more to the point where now almost every city in America has their police force go through this indoctrination. And I've spoken to people, African Americans, who have gone through this, and the sense is terrible discomfort because they see what this is. Then they see what happens in Ferguson. They see what happened in Minnesota to George Floyd and everything in between, Eric Garner and on and on and on. And how the police has been militarized in America to emulate what Israel does in Hebron and other cities in the West Bank and in Jerusalem and so forth. Every time Palestinians try to protest, every time Palestinians try to do anything, they come with massive force. And that's what they've been emulating here in the United States. But Israel has a long, like I said, besides here in the United States, which is now becoming more and more of a neo-fascist country in terms of the police and the way it operates, and the government and the way it operates. Israel has been arming and training police forces and special police and security forces of every dark regime under the sun.
Yeah. And
can I say something really quick? Something that Mick talked about in regards to the boycott, in regards to the targeted campaigns, and in regards to how an Israeli ambassador ought to be greeted and welcomed or not welcomed. I think this is so important. This is so to the point, because actually it is the toughest job and the worst job in the world. It has been for some time to be an Israeli diplomat in Europe. They're the most hated people on the planet. They're the most hated people in their country. They're the most despised diplomats. And again, when they show up to universities, when they show up to events, to cultural events and so forth, they're always met by good people who are standing up and protesting. And this should be, I don't think you could overemphasize just how important this is to keep it up and to make it grow more and more and more. If they show up to football matches, if they show up to cultural events, academic events, they need to be treated like the pariahs that they are. They represent violence. They represent racism. And they need to be told that to their face. And this Hotoveli, who was coming to be the ambassador in the UK, you can't imagine a better representative of what Israel really is than her. And so I can't overemphasize how important it is to pointedly target these people and make sure they know they're not welcome.
No, indeed. Well, I mean, there's a challenge, and I'm sure that groups, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, will certainly rise to that challenge. It is so important. We're probably drawing to a close now, but I just wanted Mick to come in and say a little bit about the influence or the involvement of the far right in the Zionist movement, the kind of interconnection between the two. And I know that this is something that you, Mick, have highlighted in the past. I mean, how widespread would you suggest that the involvement of the far right movements like the EDL are actually involved with the pro-Zionist movement in this country? Are you still with us, Mick, or have we lost you? I think we've lost Mick as well now. Yeah, it's just you and me now, Miko. Probably. Probably a good point to sort of wrap it up anyway. But thank you very much indeed, Miko, for taking the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Informative session. We went on a little bit longer. We were planning to do 2 hours if we'd got the full panel. Real apologies to people who tuned in and hope to see Tom Suarez and Azzam and Bessam Tamimi. I don't know what happened, but obviously they were coming in from overseas, and clearly we've not been able to get the link up to them, and we may be able to get them on the show in the future. But I hope you found this evening's broadcast interesting and stimulating, and it set a number of challenges about what we need to do to raise the situation about Palestine, what's happening there, the abuses, the exploitation, the human rights violations that Israel is meting out. And it's really, I think, incumbent upon all of us who believe in human rights, who believe in decency, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinian people. This is so important. We need to highlight and expose the connections between British companies and the British state, where they are working hand in glove with the Israeli authorities. We need to highlight that. And we need to, as I say, demonstrate our solidarity going forward. But I just want to say a big thank you to Miko for his involvement this evening, to Mick as well, and particularly to Issa for tuning in and giving us the benefit of his experiences on the ground in the West Bank. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this evening. And we'll be back on air next Wednesday, and I hope you'll be able to join us then. Thank you and good night.